The first 2 minutes are a slow burn, establishing the heavy atmosphere of a high-altitude patrol in 1944. We hear the rhythmic, hypnotic drone of the P-47 Thunderbolt engines. The camera lingers on the farm boy, our protagonist, who looks out of place in his flight suit. Through voiceover or internal monologue, we learn that while his peers spent their youth studying aeronautics and sports, he spent his nights fixing broken combines and predicting storms. This background isn't just flavor, it's the reason he sees the sky differently. While the squadron leader barks orders to maintain a standard combat box formation, the farm boy is watching the way the light glints off a distant cloud bank, realizing before the radar even picks it up that an ambush is coming from an impossible angle. By minute 4, the screen explodes into chaos. The Luftwaffe arrives, not in a skirmish, but in a wall of steel. This is where the 8-minute arc peaks. The rules of the era dictated that a heavy P-47 should never engage in a turning dogfight with the nimble German Bf-109s. It was considered suicide. We watch as the farm boy's squadron is methodically picked apart because they are sticking to the manual. The radio chatter is a mess of panic and rigid military jargon. Then, the turning point. The farm boy snaps. He cuts his radio, pulls a violent, gut-wrenching maneuver called a hammerhead that should have stalled his engine, and dives vertically through his own fleeing formation. The final 3 minutes of this act are a visceral, high-speed masterclass in reckless flying. He isn't aiming for the wings, he's aiming for the cockpits. He uses the massive weight of the P-47 as a physical weapon, screaming through the German formation at speeds that cause his instruments to shatter. Every time his commanding officer regains radio contact to order him to return to formation, the farm boy answers by downing another German plane. He is breaking the laws of physics and the laws of the Army Air Corps simultaneously. As the 8-minute mark hits, he has single-handedly scattered the German elite squadron, leaving the sky filled with parachutes and burning debris, and his own wingmen wondering if they just watched a hero or a dead man walking.
The sky over occupied Europe was never meant to be a playground, but for a boy who grew up dodging lightning strikes on an open-air tractor, the death zones of the Luftwaffe felt strangely like home. This is where the manual died and instinct took over. The military high command viewed the P-47 Thunderbolt as a high-altitude interceptor, a scalpel designed to operate in the thin, freezing air 5 miles above the earth. But the farm boy saw it differently. To him, the 7-ton aircraft wasn't a scalpel, it was a heavy-duty thresher. While his squadron stayed at the regulation 20,000 feet, he pushed his nose down, diving until the altimeter spun into the red. He didn't just break the altitude floor, he shattered it, dropping until his propeller wash was literally flattening the wheat fields of northern France. This was the dead zone. To the Germans, no pilot was crazy enough to fly a heavy fighter at the height of a telephone pole. Their massive anti-aircraft batteries were calibrated for high-altitude bombers, their gears too slow to track a silver blur moving at 400 miles per hour between the barn silos. He was using the earth itself as a shield, hiding behind hills and church steeples, popping up only when he was close enough to see the terrified expressions of the German supply drivers. The technical heresy didn't stop at the altitude. He treated the P-47's Pratt & Whitney engine with a terrifying familiarity. Back in Iowa, he'd learned that a machine will tell you it's dying long before the gauges do. During a frantic dogfight with a flight of Messerschmitts, he did the unthinkable. He cut the throttle and dumped his combat flaps while in a vertical climb. According to every instructor at Randolph Field, this should have resulted in a fatal stall and a one-way trip to the dirt. Instead, he used the sudden drag to pivot the massive plane on its tail, a maneuver he'd perfected while whipping a tractor around a tight fence line. The German pilots, trained in the rigid, elegant schools of the Luftwaffe, had no counter for a flying machine that moved like a cornered animal. They overshot him, their sleek wings flashing past his canopy, and in that heartbeat of reckless genius, he turned the hunter into the harvested. He didn't fire in the short, disciplined bursts required by the handbook. He leaned into the trigger, letting the 850 caliber machine guns roar until the barrels glowed a dull cherry red. He wasn't aiming for the wings, he was aiming for the heart of the machine, ripping through engine blocks and fuel lines with the same brutal efficiency he used to clear a stump-filled field. But the most forbidden part of his flight wasn't the shooting, it was the mechanical sympathy. On the long, lonely flight back to base, with an oil-streaked windshield and a cylinder head temperature that would have made any other pilot bail out, he stayed. He listened to the rhythm of the pistons, feeling the miss in the engine through the soles of his boots. He bypassed the automatic systems, manually feathering the prop and nursing the dying beast home by listening to the metal. When he finally hit the runway, the plane didn't just land, it collapsed. He had pushed the machine 300% past its design limit. As he climbed out of the cockpit, his face smeared with grease and hydraulic fluid, he didn't look for a medal, he looked for a wrench. He had just rewritten the laws of aerial warfare, not with a pen, but with the calloused hands of a boy who knew that sometimes, to get the job done, you have to break every gear in the box.
The roar of the Pratt & Whitney engine is replaced by a silence so heavy it feels like lead. The farm boy is no longer in the cockpit. He is standing on a waxed linoleum floor in a windowless room, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and military starch. Across from him sit 5 generals, men whose chests are covered in more ribbons than a state fair prize cow. To them, he isn't the man who just downed 30 planes. He is a glitch in their perfect machine. He is a variable they cannot control. The first 3 minutes of this confrontation are an exercise in psychological warfare. The prosecution doesn't lead with his victories, they lead with his crimes. They lay out a spreadsheet of destruction, not of the enemy, but of his own equipment. They cite the thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel wasted on non-standard maneuvers, the charred gun barrels that had to be scrapped, and the airframe of his Thunderbolt, which was so warped by G-forces that it could never fly again. They call it criminal negligence. They call it cowboy logic. They argue that a victory won through the violation of orders is more dangerous than a defeat because it encourages others to stop listening. But the farm boy doesn't flinch. He stands there with his hat in his hand, his eyes fixed on a point just above their heads. When he finally speaks, the script shifts from the sterile room back to the visceral reality of the front lines. He doesn't defend his maneuvers with physics, he defends them with lives. He reminds them of the Red Tail infantry division that was being systematically erased by a German armored column until he illegally broke formation to intervene. He tells them that the manual was written by men sitting in air-conditioned offices in Washington, while the war was being fought by boys in the mud who didn't have the luxury of standard operating procedures. Then comes the surprise. Just as the lead general prepares to sign the papers for a dishonorable discharge, the heavy oak doors swing open. A heavy-cud colonel from the 1st Infantry Division walks in, clutching a handful of dirty handwritten letters from his own men. He doesn't salute the generals. He walks straight to the farm boy and shakes his hand. He tells the board that if they court-martial this pilot, they'll have to court-martial every soldier who watched him save their lives.
He reveals the curious thing that the High Command tried to suppress. The German pilots he defeated weren't rookies. They were the yellow-nose elites of the Luftwaffe. They weren't beaten by better technology. They were beaten because they couldn't predict a man who didn't know he was supposed to be afraid. The final minutes of the story capture the uneasy truce between the rebel and the institution. The charges are quietly shelved, not dismissed, but buried in a file that would stay classified for decades. The farm boy is sent back to Iowa, not with a parade, but with a simple train ticket and a strict order to never speak of his irregular tactics. The video closes on the image of that same man, decades later, leaning against a fence post as a modern jet screams overhead. He doesn't look up with envy. He looks up with a smirk. He knows something the world is only just beginning to realize, that the greatest weapon in the history of warfare wasn't the plane, the guns, or the radar. It was the refusal of a common man to let a rule book get in the way of the truth. He didn't just win the war, he proved that a farm boy's reckless heart is the one thing no empire can ever truly train for.
Mission complete. If this intel earned your respect, like and subscribe. Well done for finishing the file.